me into doing a talk on ghost towns. Ghost towns and old houses are a whole lot the same. Okay, you're going to hunt them very similar. Well, ghost towns usually are nothing but a bunch of houses. But the big thing you got to remember is get all the information you can on it. You want maps, you want pictures, you want stories, whatever you can find out you want to know before you go. Because if you don't, what will happen is you just flat won't, you'll waste your time. You won't know where to hunt or anything else. And so it's the same way with a house. If a house was, you had a house here, if you can find a picture of the house, especially when it was newer or as it was collapsing even, just so you know where the house was, where it faced, and trees around it. And most of the old houses, we'll just talk about houses for a minute, most of the old houses didn't have air conditioning. So in the summer, everybody sat around the biggest tree outside, usually in the back or the front, depending on where the tree was, so that the wind, as it blew from the south, would cool you off and you could enjoy sitting outside after dark. But now, during the winter, if you sat outside, you sat on the south side of the house because you wanted to block that cold north wind. And most houses didn't have much of a heater, and a lot of them had no heater and no heat at all. So you just had your box planks that were sitting together, and if they were real lucky, they had a slat over them. If not, you had probably a half-inch crack that the air just blew straight through it on a cold norther. So that's why the quilts and stuff were really popular back then, to keep a little warm. The only heat would have been probably the cooking stove. And if you go back further enough, cooking stoves were never put in the house. The reason they were not put in the house, if they happened to catch fire, they didn't want to burn the house down. They had a little outhouse, shack out back, that's where they cooked. So you got to know your history of the area. No, they didn't cook in the outhouse, but it was an outbuilding. It was an outbuilding, excuse me.
That's what it sounded like.
Okay, so anyways, you really need to know as much about where you're hunting and that, and who lived there, basically. Was it somebody had money, somebody didn't, somebody had kids, somebody didn't. You need to know as much as you can so you know. Kids would have lost toys, marbles, and metal toys and stuff. You wouldn't have had pocket knives. And if they had money, you would want to go to wherever the men sat. Because the men probably would sit around like today, put their hands in their pocket, and possibly pull out and drop a coin. You're not going to drop a lot of coins, because coins were really important in those days. You know, you go back far enough, if you made a nickel, that was a whole day's pay. So you really didn't want to go back and waste a day's pay by losing it. If you dropped it, you probably tried to find it. So people were really very careful with their money in the early days. And that. So that's kind of, and then if you go to a ghost town, you want to find where they had gatherings, okay? They had parks, pavilions, they had possibly baseball fields or volleyball, whatever. You like that. Because there's where a lot of people were, and there was a lot of action. And the best place is if you can find an old beer joint. Because even in those days, men, for some reason, they couldn't drink beer with their wedding band on. They had to take it off and put it in their pocket with the keys if they had a car. So when they went and drank beer, they didn't want to get it wet or something. And a lot of women found out that they couldn't drink beer either with wedding bands on.
I did have mine on.
Yeah, Susie can, she says, but a lot of people couldn't. And you're not really sure, dance halls are another place to go. If you find a dance hall, beer joints, those are good places to hunt, especially where people park their cars or horses or whatever they rode on. It's always a good place to hunt around there because most people that went there didn't leave sober, whatever the reason was. So I don't know if the beer was cold and that made them drunk or what. Anyways, most of them didn't leave sober. So if you find old swimming areas in there, often they had a like pond or stock tank type thing where they swim. Some of them were just a creek that they had a little dam across and they swim above the dam. But if you find there, they also camped on the ground, picnicked in that around there. So there might be some stuff around there. You want to know. Now, big thing is, there's so many ghost towns around that you just can't figure it all out. One of the things, most of you heard of Oso up in Washington. There's an Oso in Texas community, and it's between Nixon and Gonzales on 97. Cemetery's still there. The rest of the community, you don't have a clue to where it was unless you know and do some research. There was also Anita, NEEDA, that was also between Nixon and I know where the school was, but I don't know where the other buildings all were. And then there's a place called 5 Mile that had down. There's a Clabbertown, and all of these are in probably 15-mile radius of each other. So I mean, these are just towns. Towns and communities were about 5 to 6 miles apart in almost all cases. Anything further than that, you couldn't make in a day to a store and get something and get back home in the early days. That's why there's so many ghost towns, because as cars got better in the roads, now you could go further. But originally you had to go in buckboards. And you hooked up the team, you get in the buckboard, you go an hour and a half to 5 miles to get whatever groceries or whatever you wanted, and load them up and get back home and put them up. You've wasted a half a day that you should have been doing chores. So people, little communities were about every 5 to not further than 10 miles apart. So if you get on the road and you don't see anything for 20 miles, there's been at least 2, maybe 3 communities in that area in the early days. If that road is an old road, if it's not a new toll road, okay? So you got to remember, you research wherever you want to go. Like in Austin, there's so many places that were here. And of course, most of them are covered up by Austin now. So, but you get outside, you can go to Burnett County, and one of the old members of the club and myself, we one time went and we found 100 forts and ghost towns in Burnett County alone.
What was your research? What was your deep research that gave you the clue on where to find it?
What we did is we started out with a map, an old map that we found, and it was one that Garrett had, and they showed Burnett County, and on Burnett County it showed 3 forts and 2 ghost towns. So all right, so we go to the History Center here in Austin and get Burnett County and start looking, and there were so many little communities. Now, a fort is defined is basically a stockade that may include only 1 house or 2 houses in many cases. But it was stockade with the, just like you see in Old Western, with your poles up and a big gate and went all the way around. And I'm not really sure if it was fully to keep Indians and that out, or if it was more to keep the animals in. Because they all had places that they would bring their cattle and goats and stuff in at night. It might have been strictly for, an animal pen. That's what they really did it for. But you can just go to a history center and pick a county, and pick a county that you may be sort of familiar with, because it's a whole lot easier then.
You bet.
If you're not familiar with anything, pick one that's outside of Travis or Williamson or Hayes, probably. Because most of those are probably built over, if you found anything. There's still Goforth in Hayes County, the old town, and it's from about 1810, 1820, somewhere like that. It was built and burnt in like 1840, rebuilt it, and it burned again about 1890, I think. And that, so last time I was out there, they were still the bank had a big old metal safe, and it's in concrete. It's still, the safe is out there, but there's nothing in it. It has been broken into so many times and busted up that everybody comes by and sees it, has to go see if there's anything left in it, and there's not. And the way to find that, the last place, is to find the old Goldforth Cemetery, and then it's real close, a few hundred yards from it.
If you're scouting an area and you're driving down the old roads and
Yeah.
stuff, what do you personally look for?
What I look for? Well, if I'm looking for a ghost town, I'm looking for things like the old gasoline tanks or something that you used to hand crank. You'll see sometimes something like that laying off on the side. You'll see a big round cylinder that seems to be sealed that may be laying out there. You can, obviously, if you see any old painted boards that are all rotted and look like they might have been a sign on the store, or old wood that's falling down, you kind of keep an eye for that. And as Art used to always say, he said, there ain't no problem, just get you a map and go into the Dairy Queen and sit down there and ask people. And before you know it, everybody will tell you places to hunt and ghost towns and everything else. I don't believe that for me, because it doesn't work. But it works for him.
It does work for us.
That's because he'd take a $20 gold piece with him.
That's right.
But, I mean, the point is you want to talk to people. And you can't be in a hurry to find something. I mean, you have to take your time. First time or two, you probably won't get a chance to get a detector out. You have to figure that's a long-term thing. You're going to have to talk to people and find out where things were. Now, there's also, I told you about Oso. There was also a place called Monthia down in Gonzales County. It was on Road 466. It had one store, a general store. It had one barbershop across the road from it. And it had a cotton gin, what do you call them? A guy that does bees. He had a big honey factory. Yeah. And then we had about three churches and a school. School closed in 1949. I know that. I remember that. So it closed in 49. And the store closed about 54. So it's been a ghost town since the mid-50s.
And you have public access to it?
And so you've got that type of situation. You want to, if you find it, it's easy.
You got a question?
Yep.
Do you have public access to it? Or is it on private property?
It's on private property now. It
That's
used to
the
be
problem
public
with
before
most
they
Texas.
decided to fence it in and somebody claimed it.
Yep.
And actually the store, the houses that the store owners, they were brothers, are both still standing. One on one side of where the store was and one on the other. So, you just have to keep looking and doing a little research. And the research doesn't have to be sitting at the library for hundreds of hours. A lot of it is you see something, a name on the cemetery. Like you see Ozo, like on 97, you stop and you ask somebody. You say, well, how did it get its name? Well, the community around here. Used to be, there was houses there, and there was an old store there. And pretty soon, you've got something to work from. So, cemeteries are a good thing to pick out a community. There's usually around cemeteries, there was some kind of community. Otherwise, there would have been family in the back where you don't have really access to them on the highways or roads. And that. So, you do that and that. So, I mean, it's... and when you go to a place, you want to go where people were. I mean, if you go to a ghost town, the best places are to hunt, which is like movie theaters, churches, public parks and stuff. There are people gathered. Now, you can hunt individual backyards, but it's going to be what that one person lost. Old schools, probably old schools are not really good unless they were a real thriving community, because in rural Texas, where schools were, they didn't sell lunches or anything until about 1950. So you go back into the 40s and the 30s, very few rural schools in Texas sold lunches. Kids had to bring their lunch. But if you look there, you have to find the old zinc tops with the porcelain inserts on jars, because they often brought soup in the winter when it was cold. And you can find pocket knives, because all the boys carried pocket knives. Girls had dolls, but a lot of the dolls were corncob type dolls. They were not metal. So you would not necessarily find those. Everybody had marbles, but marbles is not metal. So you might dig one up if you're digging something metal, so you have to watch. But, you know, a lot of them. But now if you get into larger communities, maybe like Austin, yes, they had money at schools because they bought things, lunches and stuff. But the rural ones didn't have lunches. So you're not going to find, in a lot of these old rural schools, you're not going to find money unless they were also a community center. And as a community center, again, the guys would be there, and they, you know, stand out there and talk in the shade or whatever, or sit and talk. They're going to put their hands in their pocket, and they're going to pull them out, and they're going to put them in and out. So eventually, a few coins will be lost. But and if you can find a domino place outside in under a big oak tree or something where they play dominoes, that's always a good place, because dominoes were the gambling type game here in the early days, in at least the area around where I was. They played dominoes for a dime a game, and also drank beer. So, you know, they had to drop a few dimes here and there. And if they're on the ground, they're apt to be kicked out of sight. So, any more questions? Yes.
I know this is probably a pipe dream, but I was either at a show or heard that some people in rural communities would, like when they started collecting the gold, that they would bury jars, like behind livestock pens and or under livestock pens.
Posthole banks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everybody, probably in the rural communities, had buried money.
Yep.
Okay, and depending on whether it was the guy or the wife, if it was the wife, they were usually in the flower bed around the house or the chicken house.
Okay.
Okay, and the chickens made a great alarm. If anything got out there, the chickens woke everybody up.
Right.
And the men usually would bury it in the garden. By sometimes the entrance gate, they would shorten the pole and dig it up and put the jar at the bottom and put the pole back in. And in the cow lot was also good. So one of the things that I found a couple of them that buried it in the old smokehouse. Because kids were not allowed in the smokehouse to play. Because that's where food was. You didn't want dirt stirred up and everything else. So they could safely bury their coins in there, put a board over it, let the grease from the sausages or whatever drip on it, and nobody ever noticed it. So I found a couple of those. But, you know, so yes, everybody had it in that, because the banks were not one of the places that anybody trusted. Yes.
California, Lake County, where I was living, rural area, some interesting person had taken a fence post and mortise and tendered, you know, and had cut it down so it had a shaft coming down, and then hollowed out the other half of the fence post, and they fit together, and then it put mud into it. You couldn't tell it. And the guy got, I think, 50 gold coins out of one of those fences.
Yeah.
And then everybody in the country was looking at fences.
Yeah.
And tearing them down.
Yeah. Well, many years ago, before most of you were here, we went to a little community called Warrington, which is one of our members' Art, kinfolks owned. And behind his house, there was a little old lady back there, and she'd cash her Social Security check every month and put all the money in the ground in a jar. And finally figured out what was going on, where all her money was going, because when she went to town to buy something, she never had any money. She'd just take it. So, okay, finally, Art and a couple other guys figured out what was going on, so they went out there and dug up I think he said it was like 80 of these jars, found them. And took them into the bank and put it in the bank in her name.
Yeah.
And so now the banker said, okay, anything she wants, you let her have it, then you bring the ticket in and we'll pay you for it. So that was going on, and she has now died. And they do not think they found all of the money, because they thought she had done this for like 60 years.
Wow.
So that would be 700 jars out there. They didn't find 100. So we don't know what she did before or anything else. We just know that she never seemed to have any money.
Good reason.
So, okay. So, you know, it's,
So you look
people
for-
do hide money.
You look for the eccentric people then.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, I
also,
was gonna say.
for those that don't like digging trash, many other people hid their money in Prince Albert cans. You run across a Prince Albert can, it's going to be metal, but it's going to be tin, because the coins do not come through that. Can't read the coins inside a Prince Albert can, so it's going to be like an old piece of rusty tin down there. And if you're out on an old homestead, you better dig it, because it could very easily be that. Yeah.
Speaking of trash, there is no trash on an old home site, because you don't know what's in it or on it or around it.
Yeah.
This is stuff that we got from our ghost town down near Matagorda, and to get the coins out even, you have to dig all the other stuff that's around it to get the coin signals too.
Yeah.
And, you know, a lot of this stuff is not collectible to me, but it is collectible, you know, and so you can find all kinds of different things out there, and a lot of things that you don't have a clue what they are.
And even after cleaning them up, you may not have a clue. But the point is, you have one, and maybe nobody else does. So you've got something nobody has. You don't know what it is, but by George, you've got one. That's important.
Yeah.
That old Model T valve stem would have been
Yeah.
that probably put that one on eBay.
There have been a lot of Model T radiator caps and other cars and wheel hubcaps and stuff. You find them a lot. Some of them are in good shape, some of them not worth a filter. And went with Ed out to an old place and got out there and found 3 grinding wheels that were just rusty as all get out. Have no idea how old they were. They were with the wire grinding wheels that had been run down to nothing. And found 3 of them, and didn't find anything good, but we did find some brass brads beside them, but not coins. But you never know.
And to give you kind of reference, this stuff that I have here may have been 15% of what I found out there.
Oh yeah.
I've got another 10 to 20% that I keep in a bin just to hang on to. Then there's another 60% that we've picked up and put in buckets, and just nobody wants to take it home, so we've stacked it out there. And then there's some that don't make it out of the hole or don't make it far from the hole, because what am I going to do with this? You know, I
It's
have
too
no
heavy
use
to
for
lug
it.
very far.
So, I mean, there's the whole gamut out there. And truly, most of the time, a treasure hunter's looking for the small target, you know. That's kind of what you listen for. And there's some pretty dang interesting big targets out there that if you don't spend the time, the guy that got us on that property found a World War I saber,
Wow.
you know, and most of the time you'd get this iron signal and and he dug it up. I mean, about that long. It wasn't complete, but it was nice.
Well,
So you
how
just-
old was that one saber that was down several years ago? I think we dated back 100 years or.
It may have been. Was it Civil War?
No, I think it was French, and they determined that it was carried by NCOs, because they were, I can't remember exactly how it went.
Wouldn't been one of the
But anyways, they thought it was an NCO sword from probably Civil War era, but they're not positive because the town was not there during the Civil War time. It became a town afterwards.
But they said there were troop movements through
Yeah.
there.
There were troop movements through there, but so I mean, you don't really know. I don't know. Bill probably knows how old it was. He probably remembers. I don't.
Speaking of overload signals, when you're in a ghost town, you do get an overload signal. It'd probably be worthwhile to dig it up, wouldn't it?
Everything.
That's what I mean.
I mean, you want to at least figure out what's causing the signal.
Right.
If you get down there and it's obviously something that you can identify as a big farm implement or something like that, you leave it. Or you pull it out and set it somewhere so if anybody else wants it. Unless you collect them. But, if you've ever gone to a place that has even an old house, you think you get trash in a park? You haven't seen trash until you've cleaned up around the house. And a lot of times, there are so many nails that you can't get all the good signals you want. And if you don't stop and pick up the nails, you're not going to get those goodies. So
Take a magnet.
take a magnet.
Take a big magnet.
Yeah. Well, most of us mount a magnet on one of our digging tools.
Yeah,
And
I've seen that.
you hit it, it pops in there, and you go on.
I take a rolling magnet and just walk the ground first to get everything off the surface,
Well,
and then.
need bigger wheels than a normal one.
Well, you can do that, but a lot of it's in the ground.
Yeah.
And it's, the best thing is if you're gonna be able to go back and hunt this place more than once, what I generally do is take something with a real small coil, fast response time, my little Tesoro Micromax, and I just sit there and every signal, I turn the discrimination off. If it's an iron signal, it only goes 2.5 inches deep. You just go, scrape. If it's iron, it clicks up, and you do that, and you kind of clean the area. Then you go back with a larger coil and maybe something that'll identify the target a little better and dig it out. If you only have one shot at it, then you use your better machine, better coil, and just pick it up as you go. But if you've got access to this place over and over again, take your time, peel the onion. Every layer is going to give you something new and sometimes valuable.
Unless anybody has like a 70-ton electrical magnet that you can just turn off and on, where you can take that big electrical magnet, just whoop, pull everything out of the ground, you're going to have to do this. But I mean, you would have to have a huge, powerful magnet to pull all that stuff out of the ground.
Mount it under your truck.
But if you could, if money's not an object and you build one on the front end loader or something and just take it and run it, hey, then you got a good place to hunt. You got all the iron up for the top 6 or 8 inches. Pull it out. But no, you do. It's one of those things that you pay your money and take your chances, so to speak, because you have to dig everything if you want the good stuff. Because most machines do not read coins below iron. If their iron's sitting here and the coins are here, most of them will not read it. Under certain circumstances, you can get a reading, but not consistent.
The old rule, get the same signal both directions or with an X.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Throw that rule out the window. Because anything that's iffy could be good.
That's right.
Well, and too, a lot of times, don't your iron leave a signal in the ground? I've dug up iron before and then come back and pass it, and it's like I'm still getting a faint signal, get the ground all stirred up, then I start getting a better signal of a coin underneath once I get the iron out of the ground.
Exactly.
Because it likes to leave oxidation or whatever in the dirt.
It does. Even your good signal does.
Yeah.
And sometimes you dig down and all of a sudden your signal disappears. And it's because you've broken that halo And that's when the pinpointer comes in handy, because then you can shove that down in the hole and say, yep, there's still something down there.
More questions?